Hi everyone, welcome to Talks at Google. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Harry Barry.
How you doing? How you doing, everybody? Great turnout, and hopefully now you'll get something out of this today. What I'm going to talk about today is the difference between anxiety and panic, and when does anxiety become a problem in our lives. A modern view of anxiety and panic, the role of our stress system, our logical and emotional brains, key players in anxiety and panic. And then we're going to go straight into what are panic attacks, how to deal with them, what's general anxiety, how to deal with it, what's social anxiety, how to deal with it, and what are phobias. That's a fair bit, isn't it? I'm going to move along at speed. Is that okay? So here's a question for everybody present. How many of you suffer from anxiety? You're a very good group, because at least a few were brave enough to put up your hands. Okay? Here's a little test for everybody. Yeah, sorry. Here's a little test for everybody. I want you to close your eyes and for 30 seconds think of the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you. The most shameful, the most awful thing you don't want anybody else in the room to know it. Is that okay? And once you've picked it, I'm going to walk up and down and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to pick somebody out and you're going to have to stand up. Is that okay? And you're going to have to tell everybody in the audience this most embarrassing thing. Is that okay? We all set? This is always wonderful because people are inclined to look away, look up, look down. Because everybody is going to feel ashamed and embarrassed. Isn't that right? Okay, so I'm going to pick somebody I think from over here, will I? Or maybe I'll go over here. Anyway, the good news for you is I'm not going to ask you to reveal the most embarrassing thing in your life. But hands up anybody who got anxious that I might. Come on. Okay, now, I think that's very important because we all get anxious, don't we? And the first big message of today is that anxiety is normal. But how did you feel physically? Did you all notice your heart going a bit quicker, your stomach more a bit of knots? God, I hope he doesn't pick me. The reason for that is because as human beings, we hate to be embarrassed. But that's how you feel when you're anxious. So I think it's important that anxiety is a normal human emotion that relates to very much worrying about what's going to happen in the future. Was I going to ask you? Fear is very much about the acute sense of the here and now, a sense of dread in the here and now. Some of you are probably panicking a little bit there that I might ask you. But I think both of these emotions are quite healthy and appropriate. For example, if I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to be doing a lot of worrying, so I'm going to be very anxious. If I meet a mugger, I'm going to be very panicky, so I'm going to be very fearful. So I think these become a problem in our lives, though, when they become really chronic and pervasive, and when there's no real danger. And they're often accompanied by this series of physical symptoms, and if there's one big message I want to get across today, it's the physical nature of anxiety. And I think what's important was when we get anxious is we all try to avoid, like you all looked away. And that was your natural instinct because you didn't want to be picked on. So our natural behaviour is safety behaviour, avoidance behaviour. And I think in modern Ireland we're seeing a huge increase in both anxiety and panic. And the game changer for us all, to be honest, has been the smartphone and social media. That has massively increased the national sense of anxiety and panic. And I think it's not unfair to say that we're all living, and some of us unfortunately are dying in the world of continuous rating, which goes on as a result of social media. I think the modern approach to understanding anxiety and panic is that all of us, through a combination of genes, upbringings, and general life occurrences, end up with having these pathways in our brain, which become fairly fixed as we're growing and developing. And our mind and our brain pathways get interwoven, each feeding on the other. As we'll see later, therapy is all about trying to change those pathways, and we call this capacity of the brain to change neuroplasticity, the ability to change. So what's quite extraordinary is the capacity of each person here to change your brain pathways to positive ones. And the mind itself, believe it or not, is the generator that we use to change those pathways. So this really opens up the very exciting possibility that we can use our mind to reshape the very brain pathways which are causing the problems for us. So we're no longer slaves of the past. but we can learn how to modify these brain pathways which cause so much difficulties with panic attacks, general anxiety, social anxiety, and phobias. And this is best done with CBT. Would you like me to do a fast bit of neuroscience? Yes. Okay. This is for neuroscience for dummies. Is that okay? We're going to do it in a couple of seconds. So we're going to do a bit of quick neuroscience. Our mood system in the brain is basically composed of 4 parts. The frontal mood component, which is our prefrontal cortex or our logical brain, our limbic mood department, which is our emotional brain, our adrenal stress gland, and glucocortisol, our stress hormone, which all make up the word flag. So believe it or not, that's what your brain looks like. Pretty yuck, isn't it? But at the front of your brain is about a third of your brain is called the prefrontal cortex. And there's some key areas here. The logic box is what you use a lot here in Google, a lot of rationality. And also, attention box is the part that you're using today when you're looking at me. The emotional control box and social control box is very much about how we manage our emotions and control our social behavior. But our prefrontal cortex, our logical brain, just think of it as your logical brain. It's in charge of reasoning, logic, analysis, planning, and creativity. It's how we create and control mood. It's very important in how we control behavior, particularly impulsive, self-destructive behavior such as self-harm or suicide. And very, very important in how we live in our social world, and very important for empathy. That's what your emotional brain looks like. It's called your limbic system. It's in the middle of your brain, very old part of the brain. And as you can see, there are a couple of key areas there. The memory box is called your hippocampus. That's where you actually organize all your memories. The island's an area called the insula. The stress box we'll be talking a lot about today is called the amygdala, and the pleasure box is called the nucleus accumbens. But basically, your emotional brain controls your stress system. It's how we process our emotions, negative emotions like fear, sadness, anger, how we store and retrieve memories, and how we enjoy food, sex, and alcohol. So this is really the more important part of the slide. Which is the bigger arrow? It's the one going for our emotional brain, isn't it, to our logical brain. And this is really important because for years it was thought that our rational brain, our logical brain, our prefrontal cortex was much more powerful. But we now realize there's far more connections going from our emotional brain to our logical brain than in reverse. Now this is critical for mental health. I would probably say if there was a single slide I was asked to show to actually explain mental health, this is it. That one slide there. Very simple slide, but actually that's the key, that very simple slide there. Because when we're well, our emotions and our logic are in harmony. For example, when we're going by our favorite Chinese restaurant or Italian restaurant and we're 3 or 4 stone overweight, and our rational brain says, for God's sake, we'll not go in here, you'll have to diet more, but your emotional brain smells the food. Which wins? Of course your emotional brain. Or it's 3 in the morning and you're out with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, it's flogging rain, freezing cold, and your rational brain says, for God's sake, will you get out of here before I get pneumonia, but your emotional brain will say, l'amour. Okay, I hope. Okay. Or I really would be worried. So I think what's really important is that every decision we make during the day is in the dance of life is a kind of a combination of emotion and logic. But when we unfortunately get into difficulties with anxiety, depression, self-harm, what actually happens is that our emotional brain turns negative on us. And when it turns negative, it swamps our logical brain, and that's when all the fun begins. So very quickly, we're going to have a look at the stress system. Very important, the stress system is critical for anxiety, and the stress system's job is to look for danger, any kind of immediate danger or perceived threat, and basically pick up on that danger and physically prepare the body to fire, to get ready for that danger. And its critical function is to protect us and not harm us. And if we can understand this simple idea, we'll understand almost everything to do with anxiety. Now, this is a very simple slide which simply shows the stress box is a little area called the amygdala, which we'll be talking about in a minute. So basically, suppose we come under acute stress, i.e. your boss has called you in and you're not sure what the hell you've done wrong, and suddenly you find that you're pumping out adrenaline. Noradrenaline would be if you're going to get aggressive with it, which is very unlikely. Adrenaline is going to be if you're feeling a bit fearful about the interview. And what happens is adrenaline is our fear hormone, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But suppose we're under some chronic or persistent stress. Well, then we start to produce our chronic stress hormone, which is glucocortisol, and this is the guide that leads to so many difficulties in our lives. So I'm going to talk about the boss of the stress system, which is called the amygdala. And this is a great friend of mine because I had great conversations with him and great discussions with people about him. Now, it's a very ancient organ buried in your emotional brain, and it's hard to believe that this guy was around in the time of the dinosaur. So before man came into being at all, the amygdala was firing. So it senses danger, it fires, and it activates the rest of your stress system. And if it activates that, it releases adrenaline mainly. So adrenaline is our fear hormone. So I think you'll find when we go to panic attacks how important this is. So our fear hormone is very much involved in, I'm going to tell you a story. When I was in Africa, I met a leopard. And I'm not joking, at 3 in the morning, they didn't believe me, but they shot him the following day. So when I met the leopard, what saved my life was the amygdala saw the leopard before I did. I froze, and suddenly my heart was pounding, I was shaking, I was sweating, I couldn't breathe, my muscles were all tense, my mouth was dry, and I had this terrible sense of dread. In fact, what the amygdala was doing was getting me ready to do a runner. So if my heart went faster, I would run quicker. If my stomach was in knots and the blood was taken out and sent to my muscles, I'd run faster. If my mouth was dry, all the blood was sucked out of my mouth and sent to my muscles, I'd run faster. And we can all identify with those symptoms when we get acutely stressed. But if the danger is then seen as more chronic, we end up secreting more glucocortisol, which is our tired but wired hormone, which we'll talk about. So there's some lovely facts about the amygdala, and you'll see why these are very important later on. First thing about it is, I call him the gunslinger, because he's trained from the time of the dinosaur to draw and fire instantly. So he's razor sharp. He's a gunslinger. Secondly, he's thick as the wall. And actually, once you understand that the amygdala is thick as the wall, you can get rid of panic attacks very quickly. Once you understand this guy is thick as the wall, you can get rid of a lot of phobias. So I think he doesn't do talk therapy. He's not particularly interested. You can't have a chat with him. He didn't have a chat with me when I met the leopard and say, what do you think we should do? He just fired. He's a long memory for fear or danger. That's the big problem. Once he remembers the danger, he'll remember it the next time and the next time, so he gets stronger and stronger. He's also counterintuitive in that you can't listen, you can't talk to him using all the normal techniques. So just to finish with the neuroscience bit, our prefrontal cortex is very important in it regulates our stress system. And really important that when we're anxious, the right side of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, is where we catastrophize what's going to happen. And the left side is the worrier. And really important is that the right side has a straight link to the gunslinger. So the more we catastrophize about something, the more it fires. So let's go on now. They're the key players in anxiety then. The amygdala in the center. When you're acutely anxious, you release adrenaline. When you're chronically anxious, you release glucocortisol. When you're worrying all the time, you're using the left side of your brain, and when you're catastrophizing, you're using the right side of your brain. So these are the anxiety disorders that we're going to deal with very quickly. Panic attacks, phobias, social anxiety, and a bit of general anxiety. So imagine John sitting at home reading the paper when he suddenly feels his heart's pounding, shaking, he's sweating, he's breathing faster, he has these terrible feelings of dread, his weakness, his throat closing in, and he thinks it's all over. It's never happened to him before, and he certainly is going to die. So welcome, John, to the world of panic attacks. And this is really, really common. I had one man, he was actually watching a cartoon show. He was laughing away, and 2 minutes later, he was in the middle of a panic attack. Full-blown panic attack. So these are very common. Up to 8% of the population will have at least one in their lifetime, but 5% of the population will have recurrent ones. I think what's important that they can be associated with general anxiety, depression, and addiction, but frequently occur in their own. They can occur in any situation at any time, and that's what the problem lies. So the fear of getting them, which we call panic disorder, is actually the biggest single problem. So we not only have to worry about the panic attack, but we worry, God, will it happen in front of my workmates? Will it happen when I'm out at a party? Will it happen in front of my friends? Will it happen in the shopping centre? So people begin to dread these symptoms. So these are the typical kind of symptoms which we've already gone through. But a really important point that for the person, there's no obvious trigger. So they can't see what started the panic attack. The guy was watching a comedy, some cartoons, so what in God's name triggered it? But the good news is that they're actually caused by the gunslinger firing. Back to my friend, the amygdala. Because it senses a danger, releases adrenaline from the adrenal gland, which pours into your body, giving you all of these extremely horrible, uncomfortable physical symptoms. So the secret really is that the trigger is the first physical symptom that we feel. And what happens then is our catastrophizing mind starts and we begin to visualize that something terrible is going to happen. And the things that people most often, and it's unbelievably how constant this is, because I have dealt with, I would hate to tell you how many people I've dealt with, and they will always come back to these dangers here. I'm going to have a heart attack, stroke, collapse or die. I'm going to completely lose control and run amok. I'm going to go mad or people will see me. So these are the dangers that the person has. So they interpret therefore these initial symptoms as dangerous, demand they stop, and of course the more that you demand they stop, the worse they get. And then what causes all the trouble is our safety behaviour, because what do people do with panic attacks? They head off to the A&E, they leave the area, they take tranquilizers, they try breathing exercises, they try most of all to stop the physical symptoms. And of course the more they use them, the more they try this behaviour, the worse it gets. So I think what's really important is that the physical symptoms of anxiety that you experience during a panic attack are uncomfortable but not dangerous. That's the key to them. They're best treated with CBT. One request to have is don't use tranquilizers, because if you use tranquilizers you stop the amygdala from changing its memory. There's a much simpler way of getting rid of them. Avoid antidepressants, because people are putting antidepressants all the time for this and it's a total waste of time. Never try and stop a panic attack. That's where everybody goes wrong. They try to stop the attack. And the visualization I give to people is imagine you go down to the sea, put up your hand and try and stop the tide. That's what it's like to stop a panic attack. Because when you get this, when the gunslinger fires an adrenaline rush, it's going to happen whether you like it or not. So we now know that if you do nothing, it'll pass in 10 minutes. If you try to stop it, it'll take up to an hour. So the modern neuroscience has shown us that if we use a concept called flooding, that it actually clears them. And flooding is this extraordinary concept where we actually get the person to visualize that they're stuck to the chair, that they can't go anywhere when a panic attack strikes. They're not allowed to do anything. But they have to visualize that the panic attack waves, these horrible physical symptoms, flood over them. And actually what happens is, but they don't try to stop them. And what happens is the gunslinger changes his memory at that moment in time. Once the gunslinger realizes that you're not assigning a danger, he actually changes. And actually from then on, the next time it happens, it's much lesser, and the next time after that, it's gone. So what we actually do is we get people to understand that these symptoms are not dangerous. They're simply a normal bodily adrenaline rush. They're uncomfortable but not dangerous. So you give the person the choice of facing the discomfort of using flooding or running from panic attacks for the rest of their life. And this is so successful that we would clear, I'd say 95% of panic attacks in one session, maybe max 2 sessions. And that's something? And that's not an idle statement now. We genuinely cleared them. We've had people with panic attacks up to 30 years and cleared them in maybe 1 or 2 sessions. Okay, happy with that? General anxiety is where we get, these are where people, mainly women, are more worriers. And they've constant bursts of intense anxiety and worry about health, family, jobs. And the key to it is that you have a constant sense of foreboding about some impending disaster. You don't know what the hell it is, but it's there all the time. And there's constant catastrophizing for what might happen. And the thing that causes the real problem are all the physical symptoms, because you get mental and physical symptoms. You get things like irritable bowel. These are kind of constant ones. Poor concentration and memory, sleep difficulties, nightmares, indecisiveness, difficulty coping, avoiding everyday tasks because you want to have them done perfectly, muscle tension, teeth grinding. Very funny, I had a lady there recently, and I was going through the thing of the symptoms about any teeth grinding, and she started to laugh because she had the guard in place from the dentist. So really common. Increased risk of panic attacks. And I think what's important is about 2 out of 3 will have at least one episode of depression in their life. But what's really important for women, this message for women particularly, is that many, many people use alcohol to try and cope with this, because the older you get, the worse it gets. And if you don't deal with it properly, you start to use things like alcohol, and lots of women use wine. I'd say the number one treatment for general anxiety amongst women is wine, and therefore lots of women become increasingly hooked on wine. So it's a really important step. In the old days, lots of people got hooked on tranquilizers. Thankfully, that's not as much any longer. And I think it's important that we get anxious because of these genetic and very much environmental pathways that are set down when we're growing and developing. And I think the key physical thing in general anxiety is that the right side of your brain is catastrophizing and the left side is worrying, and both are causing to a lot of cortisol being released, glucocortisol. And glucocortisol is the guy that's giving you the tired but wired feeling, the teeth grinding, and all these physical symptoms at night. Ideal treatment is holistic: exercise, nutrition, yoga, all of a roll. I think CBT is really good. Try, if you can, to avoid use of antidepressants, because in general they're not necessary, and the vast majority of cases they actually really worsen the issue.
Could you explain what CBT is?
CBT, I'll do it at the end. Is that okay? CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. Okay, I'll give you an example. Believe it or not, when I went through the panic attacks with you, I was actually giving you cognitive behavior therapy exercises. Isn't that interesting? You've already had some. Okay. Okay, so what we do in CBT, which is that we'll try to reshape the person's thinking and their behavior. So in other words, the thinking behind general anxiety is a demand for control. So if there's one word that describes general anxiety, it's the person who wants to be in control. The person who wants to get everything done perfectly, everything always on time, want to control every facet of their life. So what we have to do is challenge that whole demand for control. And they also have a great tendency to catastrophize, so we have to teach them skills how to do that. But particularly we have to go after their behavior, because a lot of people end up spending avoidant behavior. So the typical example would be you have a job to do and you want it done perfectly, and you're so anxious about doing it that you keep delaying putting it off. And then it gets closer and closer to the time it has to get done, but you're getting more and more anxious. So actually it ends up with you incredibly anxious, doing it at the last minute, and feeling more anxious then that you haven't done it properly. So it kind of builds on itself. I always use the example, but I get into trouble with the girls when I do this, of imagining having the ironing there and saying, well, sure, maybe I'll do it tomorrow, and then tomorrow comes along and you say, oh, maybe I'll leave it till tomorrow, and suddenly you have a pile of ironing going and you wonder how the hell am I ever going to start into that? So, you know, that's the kind of world of a person with general anxiety. Social anxiety is another common, really disabling condition. This is where a person suffers from constant social anxiety in social situations for a period of greater than 6 months. The secret here is that they're experiencing a sense of being judged, and being judged harshly by others, and feeling embarrassed by their own actions in social situations. And I think what's important, that they're also accompanied by a lot of physical symptoms like blushing, sweating, your mind going blank, stammering. And unlike most other phobias, continuous exposure to people doesn't make it any better. And I think the critical thing is that most people end up avoiding social situations. And I've had lots of young people who, for example, struggle to go into relationships. And the reason they struggle to go into relationships, because when they go into a social situation, they're so anxious and so embarrassed that they don't know what to do. The lovely thing is that within 4 or 5 sessions, we can get people back to normal and back out socialising. My day was made one day when this lovely young lad I'd done about 4 sessions with, and he came in and shook my hand and he said, because he had struggled even to talk to a girl, he said, I now have a date. Good. I said, we've done it. Okay. Okay. So there are 2 kinds of social anxiety. Performance situations. This is where, like somebody like myself doing this, become incredibly anxious because I'm acutely aware of what you'll think of me, which I am, of course. Social interaction situations where we're going to be out involved, say meeting people at a party and things like that. So these are typical social interaction situations where I might have to initiate a conversation, meet some strangers, go to parties, meet people over for dinner. Meeting friends in the pub is a nightmare for a person with social anxiety. They'll spend hours beforehand preparing. Expressing a personal opinion or being assertive or talking to people in authority. And these are typical performance situations: public speaking, speaking in front of classes, eating, drinking, believe it or not, being in the restroom, some people get incredibly anxious that people will be observing them in the restroom, which is very scary. Playing sports in front of others, I had a lovely example of a lad who was brought to me, very good tennis player, and everybody thought that he was not performing because he was so anxious that he would do it perfectly, but it wasn't. When I got everybody out of the room, his problem was that he was so upset that people would see him sweating on the court, that he couldn't perform. Isn't that interesting? To nothing. So when we cleared that, that was the end of that. Being caught out or making mistakes in the presence of others. So typical thoughts in a social situation might be, I have nothing interesting to say and people think I'm boring. That's the great word. And I hope nobody will see me blushing or sweating, because that's what everybody is afraid of. Or what an extraordinary statement. They'll see that I'm anxious in my eyes or in my face. And I hope nobody can see how anxious I am, because if they do, they'll think I'm weak, and that's the key to social anxiety. People think that we're weak. And these are kind of typical behaviours. Would you like me to go through what happens to a person going out to a party? Because this is a classic example. So it starts maybe a couple of hours beforehand, and they start the rehearsing. They check themselves in the mirror. How do I look? Do I look anxious? Am I blushing? Am I sweating? And then they start rehearsing, what am I going to say? And what would be a good thing that, or kind of topic if I were to bring it up at the social situation? And then they get down to the party or to the local pub. If the guys, most of them will go straight for the booze, straight for a pint. Most of the girls will go to the restroom and check, am I blushing? Am I sweating? And then from that, people will then stay basically close to the exit. People will spend a little bit of time maybe trying to stay away from the centre of the crowd. They'll be really try not to initiate conversations. And if they do, try and rehearse what they're going to say before they say it. And then when they go home to do a post-mortem. Jesus, what a nightmare. Isn't that a nightmare? And that's only just gone down to the local pub. And that happens every solitary social situation. So the great thing about this is you completely clear it very, very quickly. So it's caused by, believe it or not, the same old gunslinger is the cause of this. He's a real old character, this guy. And basically what he's doing, he has learned to misread faces. And it happens usually as a result of something that happens in our childhood, where we say we're made a fool of or mocked in some way, in some public situation, either in our family situation or very often at school or in some public situation. So our amygdala begins to misfire and misread faces. And the key again is the old CBT skills again. And the good news, we can challenge the irrational belief and unhealthy behaviours very quickly in social anxiety. So the key for the danger for the socially anxious person, this is what they're worried about, is that people will see they're anxious, and if it's public speaking, they'll see they're anxious and clam up and lose track of where they are. And then everybody will judge them as weak and as a failure. And they want 100% certainty that everything must go well and that nothing can go wrong, and they can never clam up. So the first thing I get them to understand is that we all clam up. We all lose track when we're giving talks, so it's the norm. So we challenge their safety behaviour, which is always to check, and double check. But the socially anxious person in social situations is what they're worried about, that people will see all these physical symptoms of anxiety. They will see them blushing, sweating. Believe it or not, some people will wear an extra jacket on, even though it's very warm in the pub, rather than see people might see this sweat. And they're constantly checking whether they're blushing and sweating, so they may be in and out to the restroom to check for that. What they have is an exaggerated picture of how bad any of these are. And they struggle often with conversation exercises. This is a key thing. One of the things I teach people is conversation exercises to try and help them overcome social anxiety. So what we have to do is challenge their thinking and their behaviour, and we have these, I'm not going to tell you what they are because they're a secret, but we call them embarrassment exercises, and they're just fantastic. I'm not joking. I have seen grown men wilt and say, I can't do that. I just can't do that. And this is like this. If you want to get better, you're going to have to do it. So actually, these wonderful embarrassment exercises are incredibly powerful at actually getting rid of social anxiety. And we can clear it in a couple of sessions very quickly. And the lovely thing about them is that by the end, I get rid of a person's social anxiety, by the way, when I have them understanding one important thing, that none of us are as important as we think we are. Is that interesting? So once I get them to realise we're not as important as we think we are, and approach themselves with a sense of humour, they're home and dry. Okay? If you nearly had enough? Will I do phobias very quickly? Are we short? 2 minutes? Okay, right. Phobias, I'll do very quick. A phobia is simply an excessive fear of being exposed to a situation or an object where you think you're going to get incredibly anxious. So these are typical ones. We all know the animals and insect ones. What lots of people probably are also aware of, that when we're exposed to situations like confined spaces, crowds, open spaces, motorways, for example, are a huge issue. Lifts, planes, blood, etc. So people get all these phobias about these things, and they literally will not go on a motorway. They won't go into hospitals because of blood. They won't go into lifts. They refuse to go into churches and shopping centres and all the rest of it. Agoraphobia is where we become fear of open spaces, and it comes from the Greek word meaning agora, which means open spaces. So I think the treatment is really, to be honest, CBT is the best way to treat them. Anything else really doesn't work. And the really important thing about a phobia is a red herring. Do you know what a red herring is? A red herring is like a false trail. And the real problem is that people think that the plane is the phobia, or the lift is the phobia, or the shopping centre is the phobia. It's not. It's what do I think is going to happen when I'm exposed to it, and that's the secret of phobia. What actually I think is going to happen is I'm going to get incredibly anxious. So when you teach people how to deal with that, because it's exactly the same as having a panic attack, believe it or not, a very similar response. Again, the gunslinger firing exactly the same way. So when you teach people how to deal with that and expose them to the phobia, you clear them very quickly. So I would commonly have people who come to me with 2 or 3 phobias. But the good news for you is if you can learn how to deal with one phobia, you deal with them all. Because it's the same process throughout them all. So I think that's basically all that I'm going to talk. We're going to have a little Q&A now. I think just for your own interest, flagging anxiety and panic is probably still available in some shops around the place. I've seen it occasionally here and there. We are doing another reprint, and it will be very available. There's also 4 YouTube videos which have been very much watched by many, many people, which go along with the book. And there's a very interesting one that I've also did with Panic Away, which has been seen by something like 330,000 people or something like that at this stage on panic attacks. And that interesting around the world. So really important. Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Barry. Great. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for your attention. That was a very detailed talk. I think you actually answered a lot of my questions. I was shuffling them under my seat there, trying to think of some new ones. Something that you and I have spoken about in the past, which I'd love you to explain to our audience a bit more, is the science behind why people might wake up feeling anxious.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting one. Many, many people come to me with general anxiety, and the first thing they say to me, I can't understand it. I get up in the morning, and I wake up in the morning, and before I can even start thinking about the day, I find my stomach is in knots. I'm feeling very tense. My muscles are tense. My heart may be going a bit quicker. And for love and money, can I kind of work out what's actually happening? So it's actually very simple when you explain to them. So what's actually happening is that when we're asleep, we dream for the last 4 hours, particularly of the 8-hour cycle. That's when we do most of our dreaming. And the closer we get to waking up, the more dreaming we do. We call this REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep, because that's what happens when you're... So all that's happening in REM sleep is that we're reorganizing our memories for the day of the previous day. So what happens is the 2 key players in that are the hippocampus, which is your memory box, and the amygdala, which is your gunslinger. So what actually is happening in the brain is actually creating almost a little story as all these memories are being bounced back and forth all of everything that happened during the day, creating almost like a little story. So you, for example, could find yourself being chased through the forest or something like that in your mind, but you don't remember any of this. But what actually happens is the gunslinger is firing full blast, just as if you were awake during those periods. So actually what actually happens is you wake up, you have no memory of the actual dream, but the gunslinger's effects, the adrenaline effects, are still going on. And what actually we start to do then is we start to say, oh God, there must be something terrible going to happen today. So now I start to visualize what's going to happen today, and then I really make myself anxious. And the reason, by the way, the gunslinger is so active in general anxiety is because it's active during the day, because we're constantly worrying all the time. So the more I worry in the daytime, the more I'm going to worry at night time. But the trouble is I don't remember it. Isn't that
That's great,
interesting?
thanks. I know you also mentioned that sometimes this filing of anxieties that we've had throughout the day can sometimes reawaken a memory or an experience in the past. And that can
Yes, and
also
yes,
lead-
exactly. Like, for example, if I do have a memory of something negative that happened to me from my dream during the night, it may re-establish the whole pattern again. But I think the important part is that the gunslinger is the secret. If you can learn to understand the physical nature of anxiety, you'll never worry about anxiety again, because that's actually what really creates the problem. It's the physical side that we don't understand. People understand the worrying, they understand the catastrophizing, but they just don't get it, that it's a physical condition. But the wonderful thing about that is that the amygdala, he's thick as the wall, but he's also completely manageable. You can put manners on him very quickly if you know what to do. It's when you don't understand them that you have a problem.
So one way maybe of putting some manners on him, you have a great analogy in your book called Spilt Milk.
Spilt milk, yes,
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so if I ask you all, what do you visualize when you visualize spilt milk? Can somebody tell me what you visualize when you visualize spilt milk?
Anybody want to share? I heard a mess.
A mess.
Smell.
Smell, horrible. You can see it in the carpet and the mess and the muck. Okay, so what I actually say to a person is, well, suppose I took the tiniest drop of milk and put it on the table. Would that also be spilt milk? Of course it would. But what we do instinctively is we visualize the drop as the pudding. So there's a wonderful technique in CBT, which is that if you're catastrophizing about something, you get out your pen and paper, and you have to prove on paper that your catastrophizing is true. Now, why that's so important is, do you remember I was showing you the area of the brain called the logic box, do you know what I mean, which is the rational part, it's the executive brain, it's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But this guy has the job of putting manners on everything else in the brain. So when you write things down, it gets involved. And you now have to rationally explain to him, imagine you're explaining to your boss, do you know what I mean, that all this catastrophizing is true, and of course you can't. So the minute that happens, well then suddenly you drop the spilt milk. And actually it's a great way of teaching yourself actually that, is it a real problem or is it just a visualized problem? And 90% of the time, by the way, it's a visualized problem.
That's great.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. So I'm asking just one more question before I'll open up to some audience questions. There's been a pretty big sea change in Ireland over the last number of years regarding this topic amongst the general public, but also you've mentioned to me there's been some changes to the GP training schemes.
Yeah, I think what's happening is most of the older GPs, and I'm almost a grandfather dinosaur at this stage, but most of the older GPs would not have had the benefit of mental health techniques, do you know what I mean? But now the assistant trainees, or these are the trainee GPs who are being trained to be general practitioners, are thankfully being exposed to what they call CBT concepts and techniques. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they will always have the time or the energy or the space to use them, but at least they have a much better understanding of them, do you know what I mean? Which is, I think, a way for the future. But one of my big things is, I actually believe that there's a big problem nowadays that we all believe we need an expert. We nearly feel to go to the toilet, we nearly need to have an expert to get us to the toilet. In reality, we all have a wonderful innate personal resilience skills. But what we need is information and knowledge and techniques. So what I would really appeal to everybody is read books like this, do you know what I mean? Develop these techniques in yourself, and you can be enormously helpful to other people, do you know what I mean? If you have these techniques yourself and people in your family. Really important to me is that we need to be resilient, you know. And what I'd love to do is, I'd love to do a rating thing. Could I do a rating thing? Can I do it? Would you like to play the rating game?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Now I want you to visualize, if you have a piece of paper you can do it, or otherwise visualize in your head a line, straight line with 1 at one end, 100 at the other end. Is that okay? Can you visualize that? Okay. Now I want you to give yourself, 1 is your crap, and 100 is you're the bee's knees. Is that okay? So I want you to give yourself a rating between 1 and 100. Have you done it? Okay? A global rating. Now I want you to visualize where other people rate you. This is your chance. They really think I'm the bee's knees. Okay? Have we all done that? Okay. Now I'm going to give you a few situations. You're diagnosed with depression and you put on antidepressants, and word goes out to all your friends and colleagues. Where do you rate yourself then? And where do you visualize other people will rate you? Okay? And let's take another situation. You're a real high flyer at your job, and then you're fired. And suddenly your financial situation takes a nosedive, and your mortgage is now in trouble, and you're now fighting with your partner. Where would you rate yourself then? And where would others rate you? Okay. But some people I do, your social media is actually trounced. People think you're just yuck. Where would you rate yourself then? And where do you think others would rate you? Interesting little game, isn't it? Now hands up anybody who didn't change their rating. Well, you're an honest group, is that okay? Because we all play this game. We call it the rating game, don't we? We spend our lives rating each other and rating ourselves. And this is what causes so much problems in mental health. Because one of the big problems in anxiety is that we're spending all our time rating ourselves. So can we rate ourselves? Is it possible to rate ourselves? Can we rate ourselves? Can we rate a human being? No, it's actually a trick. Because in real life, is there any scale that we can actually use that can rate ourselves? There isn't, sure there isn't. So in reality, I ask you to join the Raggy Doll Club. The Raggy Doll Club is a wonderful place on which I am chief bottle washer, so I'm very comfortable here. But to be a member of the Raggy Doll Club, you have to have messed up. Is that okay? So I'm very happy there. Is that okay? But there are 3 rules. The first rule is you're not allowed to rate yourself as a person. Second rule is you're not allowed to accept anybody else's rating of you as a person. But the third one is you are allowed to rate your behaviour, but not and your skills, but not yourself. What a wonderful place to be. Now, it comes from a cartoon series in the 80s where all these little dolls would be made. And they weren't perfect, they were thrown in the reject bin. So it got tired of being called the rejects. So they formed their own club. So it was hijacked by a friend of mine for mental health. Is that okay? So I have hundreds of girls that carry ragged doll in their bag. The guys won't carry ragged dolls, so they carry a little fob. Do you know what I mean? Is that okay? But what it does, it kind of is a way of, believe it or not, I never have a problem with a person with depression who comes into me and rates themselves at 10. They grab the ragged doll immediately. My problems are the high achievers. The people who come in and rate themselves at 95 or 97. And they drop to 90 and they can't handle it. I remember one particular guy said to me, "What do you mean I can't rate myself? I live for my rating. That's all I live for." I said, "Well, why are you here?" In other words, if you're winning at your rating, why have you come to see me? Because we actually don't win at a rating. We just put ourselves under enormous pressure.
That's amazing, yeah. Thank you. That was really insightful. I think we probably have time for maybe 2 questions. If anybody would, is there a hand up? No? You can see back up there, right? Do you mind passing this one?
Thank you. My name is Kelly. I have a question about something that I think if I read correctly, it was saying that suicide is driven by the logic side of the brain.
No. What happens in suicide, if you really want to know what happens in suicide, is our brain turns completely negative and we start to have this ruminatory thoughts. And those ruminatory thoughts are that I am a failure, number one, but the one that kills people, the one that really distresses people, is that they begin to believe that this incredible distress that they're feeling will never end. And that they're the failure for letting it happen. So the only way they can get rid of this incredible distress, which is, by the way, the ruminations that are going on in their head, is actually to take their own lives. And that's incredibly constant from survivors, do you know what I mean? They can all relate to that. And it doesn't matter whether you are thinking of taking your own life because of depression, or because of shame, because of something terrible that's happened to you and you've been found out, or whether it's financial problems, or it's that you get so distressed that you believe that the problem is insolvable by any other means, and it's going on night and day in your head. And because that terrible distress won't go away, you get to the point where I can't put up with the distress any longer. It's not that you want to die, it's you want to stop the distress.
But is the distress on the left side or right side?
No, the stress is your emotional mind. Do you know what I mean? That's your emotional mind. Yeah, now that's coming from your emotional mind. But what actually happens is normally there's a kind of a check balance coming from the logical mind. Do you know what I mean? So your logical mind normally keeps your emotional mind in check. But once it turns negative, it swamps the logical brain, and the logical brain just can't get a look in. And that's what happens. And when the person makes an attempt and survives, very often they're almost snapped back to kind of a situation where their logical brain maybe has a better chance of being re-engaged, you know, particularly if they get some help. But if they don't get help, they revert back to where they were. Do you know what I mean? Which is it's a very, very good question, actually. You know.
Thank you. Any final question? The question down the back there. Could you just get there? I'll get the mic to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It's a really interesting talk. You were talking about social anxiety and how you can deal with it yourself. My question is more related on how you deal with people that are around you with social anxiety. I think your first urge is to want to push them into these types of situations. And I'm just wondering, by doing that, is that more harm than good?
Yeah, it won't work. It's a bit like if, for example, you have a person with a motorway phobia, you can get them onto the motorway, but unless they understand what's happening to them and what's going to happen and how to deal with it, they're never going to be comfortable. They're going to immediately, the next minute you turn around, they're going to be gone. If you force a person with social anxiety into social situations, they get worse because they need the help, they need the techniques. But the good news is that once they understand what's going on and do some of my famous embarrassment exercises, very quickly they grab what's actually happening to them in social situations, and you just give them a few little techniques and skills and they're home and dry. Do you know what I mean? So I think they really will, an awful lot of people will benefit from, say, reading the book, looking at the videos, and if necessary, going for a little bit of help. Because to be honest, really, if you get to the right person, this can be sorted out really, really fast. Do you know what I mean? And but never push a person with social anxiety because it won't really work.
Thank you for that. We have, has a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so our last one. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Just a quick one. Why is it so quick to actually retrain the brain in a couple of sessions?
Well, I suppose by the time a person usually say would come to see me, they are really anxious, if you want to put it like that, to actually to do something about it. I think when we say it's not so much that it's quick, but if they do, when I give them exercises, they have to keep repeating those exercises over and over again. Do you know what I mean? And the thing about the brain is, the brain the first time doesn't get it, or gets it a little bit. The second time it gets it a little bit. The third time it's getting it more. The fourth time it's getting it more. By the time you've done it 10 times, it's really got it. So that's the way the brain works. If you think about it, if you're trying to learn a skill, for example, learning how to drive a car, you don't go into the car, get some techniques, and go and drive the car. You practice and you make mistakes, and you practice and you make mistakes, and but gradually you find you're getting happier and happier, and suddenly it becomes instinctive. And that's what happens in your brain. We call that neuroplasticity. That's the ability to change your brain pathways. And the good news is that something like the amygdala changes almost instantly, really quickly, so you can turn him around quite quickly. But social anxiety, because it's involving tracks between your emotional brain and your logical brain, takes a little bit longer. Do you know what I mean? You have to do a bit more work.
But on the amygdala, why is it so quick to actually change?
Because he's a tick organ. He's very basic. He doesn't get it, So his job. You can imagine a guy stuck in a little office somewhere with headphones on, and somebody shouts danger, and he just press fire. Do you know what I mean? So somebody says down the danger, so he downs the danger. He doesn't really think it out, but he actually downplays very quickly. And it's really interesting to see this in practice. And by the way, the gunslinger is really important in depression as well. He's probably the major cause of depression because, for example, a friend of mine professor from Oxford, she, for example, did this fascinating experiment where she took all these people with depression and scanned their amygdala's responses to something negative, to a negative face. And actually what was really interesting was that bit by bit, or when she was doing her scanning, she noticed that every solitary person, their amygdala was overactive. Every solitary one. And when they got some treatment for a week even, do you know what I mean, that even though their depression wasn't lifted, she could actually tell the ones that were going to improve and the ones that weren't going to improve because their amygdala went back to normal.
Yeah.
So isn't that fascinating? So in other words, this particular tick organ, unfortunately, is really important in our life, and he causes most of the difficulties in our lives. But he is very, very, very trained.
That's amazing. Thank you, Dr. Barry. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I have loads more questions for you, as I'm sure our audience do. But thank you very much for coming in and for your time.